right, so I just want to quickly go over the weekend's vocab quiz. Because I think you got all of the terms technically correct,
Okay.
but there were some things that you weren't kind of like
Hiding.
connecting to course content. So I just want to kind of try to make sure that all of those pieces are getting put together. And there's going to be another one, of course, right, this weekend. It's going to be number 10. So after that, I'm going to be replacing, so only 10 of the vocab quizzes are going to count towards your grade.
Okay.
So the last 3, just like with the reading quizzes, are going to replace your lowest grades.
Am I missing just the one vocab quiz, or is there?
I think probably only one.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's only one that you missed.
I think it was one vocab quiz and then that reading quiz, right?
Yeah. So and like one of the reasons I don't do, actually this is one of the things I do in lieu of makeup quizzes, because frankly this is easier.
Yeah.
I don't have to try to schedule,
Yeah.
for people to be here when they wouldn't ordinarily be. Yeah. So for Monday, you're going to be reading The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and I'm just going to tell you right away that you're probably not going to understand it.
Okay.
And that's okay,
Okay.
right? There's nothing wrong with that. The poem is deliberately difficult, it's deliberately kind of inscrutable, but it's really, really influential and extremely historically important. And it's going to build on a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today.
Okay.
So I still want you to read it. But yeah, I'm not going to, I'm giving you a reading quiz on it would be mean.
Okay.
So I'm just going to tell you that the next week's quiz won't be on The Wasteland.
All right.
Please show up prepared. But yeah, don't sweat it if you don't get this poem.
Okay. Typically when I have poems like that, like when I took, I think it was British Literature 1, there was some stuff that I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot understand this. And so I would read it, but I would look up a summary and analysis of it, read that, and then I would go back and reread it, and it made more sense. So.
And if you want to do something like that, that might help you. Yeah, and
That's
I think
typically what helps.
Yeah, I think the stuff in Britlit one, because you took that with Jeff Waldrop probably.
Online.
Yeah. I think the stuff that probably the issue there is more kind of distance in time.
Yeah.
From us, that things that an audience in the 15th century would have.
Yeah.
Been
and then it was also
common knowledge for us.
we were not getting any context for anything. We were you cover all the bases, everything's relevant to last week's class. We get history, we read just not even just the poem or whatever it is. We read the introduction and background on it. So that is always really helpful in terms of context. Because I would just be what is this?
Well, and I think
I have to look it up.
Yeah, I think some of it is that Jeff and I have different approaches and focuses. I'm very much coming out of a Marxist historicist school where basically context is everything, right? That there's no such thing as individual genius. Art rises out of material historical circumstances. Jeff is coming more from a kind of aesthetics-based background.
I agree.
And he's much more concerned kind of with form and with the way a poem is put together or the way a novel is put in and that sort of thing. And I think that both approaches are valuable, but I think that probably it's easier to get through a survey class with that kind of Marxist approach.
I agree. Helps me understand a little bit what's going on.
I also in this class I probably do a lot more kind of drill it and kill it information than Jeff does, and part of that is I know it's not exciting, but I think part of it is to just try to improve your memory and to give you a vocabulary for talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
With that in mind, let's go over our last vocab quiz. Okay, so Irish Literary Revival, what is that?
Wasn't that a big rise of like Irish like art, poems, literature, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an attempt in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to establish a specifically Irish literary movement in English. So on the one hand, it's pushing back against the hardcore nationalists who want everyone speaking Irish again. But also like carving out within that space, or like an independent Irish identity that still, that English speakers can still claim as their own, right? So it's also probably worth noting that this comes in two waves, right? The earlier wave is writers like W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory and J.M. Synge. They're mostly Anglo-Irish Protestants, though not all. And they are very much concerned with rural Ireland and with Irish folk material. The second wave includes writers like James Joyce and Shauna Casey. And they are much more focused on urban Ireland, specifically Dublin, and on the experiences of, in Joyce's case, the middle class, and in O'Casey's, the working classes. And they tend to be, their view of Ireland tends to be a little bit less romanticized than that older generation's view. So you can almost think of it as being kind of like that split, a little bit like that split between the older and the younger generations of romantics. All right, the lock of golden hair.
This was used for a transaction.
Yes.
With some goblins. Get some sketchy fruit.
Yes, this is what Laura uses in Goblin Market to buy the goblin's sketchy fruit. I like the way you put that. Yeah. And the significance of this, and I think this is what was missing in your answer, is that it relates to these Victorian gender discourses, right? And that the only currency Laura has is her beauty. So she literally has to use that to pay the goblins for their fruit. And then she also has to stay and party with them.
Yeah.
All right, Lizzie. Who's Lizzie?
Lizzie was Laura's sister. The smarter of the two, in my opinion.
Certainly the more cautious.
Yeah. I would say her character kind of represented, like, I just wrote Leslie. I feel like her character modeled like more of like the moral kind of like, I don't want to say like angel in the house, but I think that kind of like not crossing boundaries. And then she has to pick up pieces.
Yeah, exactly. I think she does kind of start out that way, right? It's like, no, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, right? You know, I'm just gonna shut my eyes and stick my fingers in my ears and pretend the goblins aren't over there. Until her sister actually falls victim to them, right? And then what Lizzie is giving us is this kind of model for a way out of the angel in the house, fallen woman dichotomy, right? She actually goes out of her way to try to rehabilitate her fallen sister and bring her back into society. And then at the end of the poem, right, you know, hey, they're both living normal bourgeois female lives, right?
Back to normal.
Yeah. All right, what does Anglo-Irish mean?
Is it Anglo-Irish, is that like the kind of like what would be classified as like Irish people, but like from like Britain descent?
Yes, that's exactly it. Someone who is Anglo-Irish is someone who is Irish but of English descent. Good. And just to be clear too, like we're talking in this period of relatively recent English descent.
Right.
So the Anglo-Irish of the 19th century, their ancestors would have come to Ireland no later, or really kind of like no earlier than, say, the end of the 16th century, which, okay, is still a fairly long time.
Yeah.
But the English people prior to the Protestant Reformation who were in Ireland were usually referred to as the Old English. And they remained Catholic like the rest of the population. In fact, you can tell an Old English Irish family by looking at the last name. Any Irish surname that starts with the prefix Fitz, that's an Old English family. Fitz actually comes from Norman French.
What other last names are there other than Fitzgerald?
So, like Fitzgerald, Fitzwilliam,
Okay.
Fitz.
Because I'm thinking, I'm like, Fitz, why not Fitzgerald?
Yeah, but even like Gerald and William are French-derived names, right? So yeah, so it's like the Irish Mick, it's like a son of kind of thing. So son of Gerald, son of William, son of Guillaume, and so on and so forth. But yeah, this is just a little bit of side note information for your edification.
Cool.
Ireland is my specialty area, so like any chance I get to talk about it, I maybe go a little overboard sometimes. All right, the silver penny.
This was the form of payment, or the coin that not getting my two sisters confused. Lizzie.
Yeah.
Lizzie confused. Instead of the lock of golden hair.
Yeah, and so what she's trying to do is engage the goblins on their own ground, right? The ground of commerce. And the goblins refuse because that's not what they want from her, right? Yeah, well, they want her to be naughty with them like her sister was, right? They reject her silver penny because that's not how women are supposed to pay for things.
Sweet.
Yeah. Well, that's like one of the creepy things about this. The goblins are like, they're not like, at least in terms of their appearance, they're not like scary goblins. Like they're cute little furry goblins. Yeah, it's. But anywho, cultural nationalism.
If you want to have about this one, you can.
Okay. So cultural nationalism is a sense of shared identity based on shared language and traditions, right? As opposed to, say, political nationalism, which is based on being forming an independent political body, right? For a cultural nationalist, what matters is shared cultural traditions, shared language, maybe shared religion, things of that nature, right? A kind of shared history, as opposed to a shared politics. And this is something that is kind of deeply embedded in this Irish literary revival. It's a cultural nationalist movement that embraces people who are political nationalists and people who are not. Okay, and I guess, we know who Lizzie is, we know who Laura is as well, right? So Laura is the fallen woman sister.
My little sister's name is Laura.
All right, I'll keep her
She'll
away.
probably be the one saving me, though.
Just keep each other away from any furry little goblins. Any suspicious fruit sellers in your vicinity. Okay, I think the kernel stone, I think, again, what was missing from this was the significance, the symbolic significance, that the kernel stone that Laura gets from the goblins turns out to be infertile, right? Much like the fun time relationship with the goblins she had was infertile, right? It's connected also to the other girl's grave, to young Jeannie's grave on which flowers won't grow, because she also partied with the goblins, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, the girls who cavort with goblins in the world of the poem end up with nothing to show for it. These are infertile, these are sterile relationships. All right, and the Celts.
This was a term used to, I wouldn't say group, maybe group.
Mm-hmm.
Celtic people together, like, right?
Is
that different than, is that Celt, the?
Okay, well, it is actually,
Short for
it's pronounced Celt rather than Celts.
Okay.
The Boston Celtics have got it wrong.
That's horrible.
But yeah, no, it's pronounced Celt or Celtic.
Okay.
And yeah, so
Wow.
well, yeah, so the Celtic cultures, right, are it's a body of cultures in Western Europe, dating from the Bronze Age, but this is the term that Matthew Arnold uses on the study of Celtic literature. To describe, in particular, the non-Anglo-Saxon peoples of Britain, right? So the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish. And what's important in Arnold's definition of the Celt, right, is he opposes the Celts, who is a kind of ineffectual dreamer, right, to the practical but unimaginative Saxon. And he argues that the English get the best of both worlds, right? That they, marry this kind of visionary quality of the Celts to the practicality of the Saxon. But unfortunately, these other poor folk, the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, only get that Celtic part. And so, he gives them that kind of backhanded compliment that, these are people who dream beautiful dreams, but who leave no mark on the face of history.
Yeah.
What an asshole.
Yeah. The fact that literally everyone I know is saying it wrong.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, it is.
Kind of took me this long.
If this isn't your area of study, it's a common mistake.
Yeah.
But yeah, the reason this is important is all of this cultural nationalist activity and this Irish literary revival, right? In Ireland in particular, arise in reaction to attitudes like Arnold's. So this is something that writers like W.B. Yeats are reacting specifically against, right? Well, I'll show you as an ineffectual dreamer, you prick. All right, and finally, this United Irishmen Rising. So I'll just cover this, right? So the United Irishmen Rising is a revolt in 1798. The goal was to create an independent Irish republic. And the manifestos were built kind of largely on Enlightenment principles, right? So it's very similar to the kind of principles that animated the French Revolution. And one of the reasons this is particularly important and why this becomes a big kind of historical touchstone, especially for people like W.B. Yeats, is that it's the last major Irish revolt in which Anglo-Irish Protestants play a leading role. in most of the subsequent revolts, Catholics are dominant. So this idea of a kind of multi-sectarian Ireland that could have been is one that really kind of fires the imaginations of a lot of Irish literary revival writers. Okay, any questions?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I would be, I'm more interested.
Well, I think
I'm very Irish as
I-
well, so I feel like I should like educate myself.
I think the Irish Lit class, I think, comes up in the rotation next spring.
Okay, cool. See if I can put that into use of my actual, like, what I need. Probably not, but maybe I'll take it. We'll see.
I think you probably have some electives, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I should be done soon, hopefully.
Uh-huh.
But the whole minor thing, I'm like,
What is your double minor?
I don't know. I still told Laura and I was like, I don't want to pick that. And she's like, Grace, you have to do it. And I'm like, I don't know. Just might do it all in one semester. Because that's a whole semester. That's 5 classes.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Everything's fine.
Yes.
Everything's great. Okay, so what'd you think of these poems?
So I just watched that movie recently, I would say like maybe a month ago, and it was All Is Something on the Western Front.
All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when I was reading the first 2 pages I was supposed to read, it was kind of just like a recap of that movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, that movie was heartbreaking, and I think the one thing that stood out to me was the fact that no one had any idea what the hell was actually going on. And like in that movie too, like they were all like, yes, we're gonna go, and then all of a sudden, boom, this was not what we expected. We thought this was war, and we were gonna be soldiers and men.
Well, and I think this is
like the illusion is horrible because they're just using it in their favor and then not have like everyone worried at home and no one wants to join fight what's going on. So instead it's just like war.
Well, and I think like one of the things that's getting at is like that this is completely different from any war that had gone before, right? You know, and not just in terms of the
so many new
scale.
things.
Yes.
Like
yes.
between like all of those countries, like the gas, the poison, like the gas. I think it was Germany that brought that out, right?
Mustard gas, I believe, might have been a German invention. Yeah. Although I remember, I
think they said that was true. And then tanks.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. Motorized tanks were a new thing.
And then trench warfare too.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like this is the only major conflict in which trench warfare was ever used, and I think that part of that is because it's an extremely inefficient way to
it literally said that everyone was dying for nothing and it was useless.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's like historically a battle typically took at most a couple of days.
Yeah.
Battles in World War I dragged on for months.
Yeah.
The biggest and best known battle of the Battle of the Somme in France ran from July 1st to November 18th in 1916, right? So this is like half a year fighting over for a relatively small gain of Allied territory and a loss of 1 million lives.
And the conditions just.
Yeah.
And then after knowing, I mean I'm not a history buff, but I know about World War I.
Yeah.
The poems, the writing, because we also talked about how the trajectory of their writing styles even changed, where they kind of went into from like this like romantic, like, you know, just like imagery and all this stuff, and then from like going to talking about they said this and they did that and this is what we did, and it's like,
yeah,
it's sad because it's very much projected in there.
Yeah,
well, it's trying to be hidden.
And so yeah, let me tell you a little bit about where that's coming from, right? So most of the poets that you read for today didn't start writing poetry during the war, right? I mean, these are all very, very young people on the one hand, right? The oldest of them, Rupert Brooke and Isaac Rosenberg, are both 27 when they die. The youngest, Mary Wedderburn Cannan, is only about 21 when she writes that poem, Rouen. Right? So we're talking about like people who are only a little bit older than you are, on the whole. Yeah, so most of them cut their teeth publishing in a series of anthologies that were called Georgian poetry. And these were named for the king at the time, George V, who reigned from 1911, I think, yes, to 1936. And these start coming out in 1912 and continue coming out even after the war, right? So they're published for about a decade, one each year. And they're edited by a guy named Edward Marsh. And as the war drags on, and as public attitudes change, the style of Georgian poetry, which I'll describe for you in a minute, becomes kind of like more and more like out of touch, right? It becomes more and more distant from people's actual experience. But what it tended to look like, right, the things that the editors of Georgian poetry valued, right? Simplicity of style and expression is a big thing. Right, so you've probably noticed that most of these poems don't use very complex form structures or even a lot of big words.
Yeah.
Right, simplicity is a big thing, and at least two of them are sonnets. So they're using a lot of very kind of, the sonnet isn't originally an English form, it's invented in Italy, but it's been part of English poetry for so long at this point, that it is basically a traditional English form. So you got simplicity of style and expression, traditional forms, and the two big emphases are rural pastoralism, right? The countryside is a really big deal for Georgian poets, and British nationalism, right? Kind of like the way for that first wave of Irish literary revival writers, the rural west of Ireland is, quote unquote, the real heart of Ireland. It's where the real Ireland lives. For the Georgian poets, rural England is the center of British national identity and is the thing that everyone is fighting to preserve. Now, World War I ends up decimating rural England and rural Scotland and rural Wales and rural Ireland for one particular reason. This actually had to do with the way men were organized into regiments. You were put into a regiment with people who came from the same place you did. And this actually, typically in the past, had worked well to improve morale, right? You're fighting side by side with people you grew up next to, people you've known all your life, and you all feel like you've already got some kind of common cause you're fighting for. But most previous wars did not involve whole regiments getting wiped out in a day. So what ends up happening is that much of the healthy young male population, especially of the rural parts of Britain, is wiped out.
Yeah.
And a lot of villages don't survive or barely hang on. But I think we can see probably two poems here that are most engaged with this Georgian tradition. And they're both written by poets who had published in Georgian poetry before the war. Right? Rupert Brooke's The Soldier and Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth. And they're coming kind of at different ends of the war here. So Brooke is writing from the beginning of the war. And let me tell you a little bit about each of these guys and the kind of the differences in their background and education, and even kind of where they come from. They're both officers, but and they both publish in Georgian poetry, but that's about where the similarities end. And I think when we're looking at these war poets, it's helpful, I think, to have a physical image of these guys, to see like these were real people.
Yeah.
So this is Rupert Brooke. Rupert Brooke was a celebrity when he enlisted in the British Navy. He was a promising young poet. He was a classics scholar at Cambridge. So this is a guy he's a celebrity professor, believe it or not. He's young, he's good looking. He was actually like a kind of popular pin-up picture for young British girls. Yeah. Right? They swooned over Rupert Brooke. Yeah. In fact, something that Virginia Woolf would later gossip to her friends about was that apparently once as a teenager she had gone skinny dipping with Rupert Brooke, right?
That's funny. Yeah, I feel like honestly people they had such a distinct look during that time period, and he looks like he could pop right out of 21st century.
Yeah. Yeah. Brooke's handsomeness did not endear him to everyone, though. I think W.B. Yeats, who didn't think much of Brooke's poetry, disparagingly referred to him as the handsomest man in England, as if that's kind of the only thing he had going for him.
Right.
But this is a guy who, again, was a brilliant and promising scholar as well, right? Now, Brooke never makes it to the front. He never sees action. He dies of dysentery while he's on the way to the front, aged 27. So Brooke's version of the war is much more nationalistic and optimistic than what we get from poets later on, whose view has been conditioned by combat experience, right?
Yeah.
So let's turn to page 139 here and look at The Soldier, right? It's a sonnet. So it's written in that traditional pattern here, right? And I just want us to kind of look at the way he uses both kind of like a particular idea of England and rural imagery.
What page did you say?
This is page 139. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave, once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. And think this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given. Her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter, learnt of friends and gentleness, in hearts at peace, under an English heaven. What do you think of this?
I think it makes a lot more sense knowing that he died before he came into the front lines.
Yeah. This is that idealized, romanticized picture,
yeah,
right?
I feel like
This is somebody who's,
like romanticizing like the war and
yeah. This is somebody who's, he's
because I
excited.
don't think there's no way in hell he would have wrote this after. I don't think. I mean, I can't speak for him, but you know.
Yeah, and the number of poets who actually have direct experience in the war, who continue to write in this kind of mode, is small, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, the things that are typically Georgian about this, right? So note the way he talks here about England and about his relationship with England, right?
And then he's saying, if I die, think only this of me. I love England.
Yeah.
I mean, I know he didn't say that,
but yeah, but it's kind of like, but that is a way of encapsulating what he's saying here. You know, this is that, you know, his very being is formed of England, right? That everything about him is England, right? There's England in his body and his soul, and everywhere he goes, he brings a little bit of England with him. And the England that he is embracing here, right? Now, does this sound like, financial, political London or industrial Manchester or Birmingham? What part of England does he seem to be most interested in, and why?
I don't know. I feel like the nature of England.
Yeah, this is rural England, right?
Yeah.
So it's very much the kind of rural pastoralism of Georgian poetry. And not all of the poets who write in the Georgian mode are actually rural themselves or come from rural backgrounds. We'll kind of cover that in a minute, but just to give you some sense of where these guys came from, right? So this is where Brooke was from, right? He was from Cambridge. Now, the next poem I want to look at as a kind of counterweight to this is Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen. So this is Owen in his officer's uniform, right? And Owen spent a good bit of time at the front before being killed in action at age 25. He dies a week before the armistice that ends the war. So he makes it almost to the end. But during the Battle of the Somme, he is trapped under fire for a long time, for several days actually, with the remains of a fellow officer. So he's like trapped in a pit with a corpse for several days, and he comes out of this and his nerves are shot, right? So what they typically called what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was shell shock. And we know this now as like a psychological and physical chemical reaction to intense stress or trauma, right? that it's a way our body responds to being exposed to something beyond which human endurance can handle, right? In Owen's time, shell shock was usually regarded as a failure of nerve. Someone who was suffering from shell shock needed to take a couple weeks leave in hospital, get their shit together, and get back out there. So if you suffered from shell shock, it was regarded as a kind of personal failing, right? It was something that was wrong with you, not that you'd been exposed to something too horrible for your mind to take.
So horrible.
So while Owen is recovering in hospital, he meets Siegfried Sassoon, and Sassoon encourages him to write poetry, or continue writing poetry, almost as like a form of therapy, right? And Anthem for Doomed Youth is one of the things that he comes up with while he's recovering. So if we go to page 161. Now, like the soldier, this is also a sonnet. And I want you to think about, as we're reading this, what Owen is doing with the rural English imagery and how it relates to or reacts to what Brooke was doing. Right, so what passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys but in their eyes, shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. So take a minute to think on this, and think about how this reacts to or builds on Brooke's poem.
It could kind of feel like a response in its own way, I think. I mean, he starts it off with the question, what passing bells for these who die as cattle, and then the fact that he's referring to them dying as cattle, I think that hits like the first second of the poem.
Yeah.
I mean,
it starts with a gut punch, right?
Yeah.
It's,
it just has such a, I mean, it's way more heavy than the other poem, but I would say in terms of he doesn't talk about his pride for the country.
No.
He doesn't seem to give a shit about that, actually. He's just,
in fact, does he talk about himself at all?
no.
On who or what is most of the poem focused? We've actually, I think, got kind of two halves of the poem, right?
Yeah.
One is on the battlefield,
Yeah,
where the
I would
deaths are
say
happening.
The boys in the war,
Yeah,
on the battlefield.
yeah, and that would be the first half of the poem, right? And then the second half is focusing on the homes they left behind, right?
Yeah.
So, just as kind of we were talking a little bit about, kind of what happens in rural Britain as a result of the war, right? This kind of clearing out of young men from these villages, right? That's what's described in the second half of the poem. right? All of these, all of these young men who aren't coming back. And kind of like the empty places left in these villages. And I think this is one thing to note is that each of these poets that we're looking at, right, is before they go, they are embedded in a particular community, right, with a particular set of relationships. So Owen, for example, comes from right up here, a place called Birkenhead. It's across the little inlet here from Liverpool. So he comes from a more urban industrial area. And so perhaps writing about things like screaming shells seems a little bit less of a stretch for him than somebody like Brooke, who comes from the university town of Cambridge. But the war touches every part of the country here and takes people from every part of the country. The music that I was playing as you were coming in here is by a composer and poet by the name of Ivor Gurney. Gurney came from Gloucestershire, which is around here down by the Welsh border. And this is him in his private's uniform. And Gurney survives the war, but spends much of the rest of his life, and he lives another 15 years after 1918, but he spends the rest of his life in and out of sanitariums, being treated for schizophrenia. His schizophrenia was probably not the worst, wasn't caused by the war, but was no doubt exacerbated by his experiences. And Gurney was Gloucestershire's prize scholarship student at the Royal Academy of Music. Now, Isaac Rosenberg, who wrote probably my favorite of the poems I had you read for today, is a particularly interesting case. So Rosenberg is a Londoner, right? So it comes from right about down here. And he's unusual in a number of ways, right? One, he's Jewish. His parents are Jewish immigrants. Two, he was too short to make the cut for regular military service. So he doesn't enlist until relatively late in the war, and he enlists in what's called a bantam unit. So a bantam is a small rooster. And these bantam units were units who didn't make the Army's usual physical requirements. Right? They weren't tall enough, they didn't pass all of the right health exams, so on and so forth, right? But the British Army starts calling these units up as the war drags on and casualty rates are getting higher and they don't have enough men to fill the trenches anymore. So they're like, well, we gotta lower our physical standards a little bit. So Rosenberg is one of those, right? Because again, I think he was 4'11". He was too short to join the regular army. And he joins because he has to support his mother and his sister. He needs a regular salary. He was a painter and a poet and wasn't making enough money at either of those. But he had studied at London's prestigious Slade School of Art. The Jewish community in London's East End had got together to gather up enough money to send this promising boy to art school. And then, you know, he's dead at 27, barely having, you know, made any kind of splash in the art. Like, you know, he doesn't live to fulfill that promise or that community's investment in him, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, the reason I point out these really very sad stories, right, is that we have these individuals whose deaths are not just personal tragedies, and they're not just tragedies for their families, right? But they kind of show, like, just kind of how much potential was cut out of this generation of young British men. But I want to look at Rosenberg's poem, Break of Day in the Trenches, in large part because I think his perspective on the war is different from just about any other poets. So if you look on page 156 here, we'll take a minute to read this, but before we get started with this, there are a couple of things about Rosenberg to note, right? So he actually also did get his start as a Georgian poet. He had published in those anthologies and was influenced by that particular view of poetry. But unlike Brooke and Owen, Rosenberg is a private, right? He's just an enlisted man. He doesn't run anything, he doesn't make any important decisions. He just goes where he's told and does what he's told. So yeah, he's not an officer. And the combination of his Jewishness, the fact that he's somebody who doesn't make the Army's regular physical requirements, and that he's just a private, right? I think, like, give this poem a really kind of interesting outsider perspective, right? So what I want you to think about as we're looking at this is how that kind of outsider perspective is reflected in the way he talks about the rat. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever, only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand, you will do the same to a German, soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure, to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chanced than you for life. Bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes at the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver? What heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop and are ever dropping. But mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. What do you think of this?
I mean, knowing everything now, it makes it so different. I feel, I mean, it makes me like, I don't want to say I pity him, but I like feel bad for him. Like, it's like, he's like, when he's talking about like the people as the rat grins inwardly as he passes, you know, being stronger and more equipped. It's like, I think he's definitely comparing himself to them and kind of using the rat.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about the comparison, though, right, is do these haughty athletes have any better chance of survival than a poor guy in a bantam unit does?
Yeah, no, definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of equalizing here, right?
Yeah.
The war has kind of leveled some of these physical advantages, right?
Yeah. So it says that the parapet's poppy is a wall, or the parapet at least is a wall protecting trench.
Yeah.
What is the poppy after the parapet's poppy? What is that?
Okay, so poppy, it's you know what poppies are? They're flowers.
Is it like poppy seeds?
Yeah, that's where poppy seeds come from. Yeah,
Okay.
so it's also where we get opium and other narcotics from, right? So these drugs that both kind of like relieve pain and cause numbness and forgetting.
Okay, that makes more
yeah.
sense than running through their veins. But
Yeah.
his in his ear.
Poppies whose roots are in man's veins. I think there's a double image there, right? On the one hand, you've got these poppies, right? These pretty little red flowers are growing out of corpses buried in the ground, right? But there is the whole in men's veins things. Yeah, it's kind of referencing like people injecting morphine
Yeah.
as a
I
kind
like
of
this one too.
What's that?
I like this one too.
I know. Yeah, it's just that there are.
There's so much to it.
There are so many
Packs a
layers to
powerful
this
punch.
poem. Yeah.
So then, what does he mean by mine in my ear is safe? What do you think?
Well, it says, poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop and are ever dropping, but mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. So safe, at least like it's balanced in his ear right now, right? It's not, so literally it's not which means there's no action going on at the moment, right? He can pause for a second to pick a flower, stick it in his ear, and have a little conversation with this rat, right?
Yeah.
And and again, like much of soldiering in this particular war was sitting around in a trench doing not much, right?
Yeah.
So you've got these periods of intense action that are punctuated by long bouts of extreme boredom. But yeah, so the poppy in his ear is safe for the moment, right? But it's a little white with the dust. What do you think about that? What's going on with the white dust, do you think?
I want to say like either ashes from everywhere or like gunpowder maybe.
Yeah, I think the ashes, right? It's kind of reminder of the fragility of this situation, right? This is somebody who could himself be a corpse in the very, very near future, right? Safe now, but yeah, that white ash is a reminder of death. And there are a lot of these kind of like images of crumbling and decay here, right? So he's hanging out, by this trench wall, which is supposed to keep him secure. But even like if we look at the first line of the poem, what does it say?
The darkness crumbles away.
What's weird about that? The darkness crumbles away. How is he imagining the darkness, like as the sun starts to rise?
Yeah. I don't know, I feel like crumbling isn't a really good term for like something coming to light, like especially if he's referring to darkness.
Yeah.
Like the darkness crumbling away, like it's like, oh yeah, the darkness crumbling away.
It doesn't sound especially positive or hopeful, right?
Yeah, it's very much like,
yeah.
I mean, the darkness is gone, but like, great, what's the sun gonna do?
Yeah, well, think about like just even the word crumble, right?
Yeah.
We don't typically think of dark, we don't, what's that?
I said everything around him is probably also crumbling.
Yeah, everything around him is crumbling, right? And we tend not to think, exactly, it doesn't crumble. It's not a physical thing that can, fall apart like that, that, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, he's describing the darkness like almost like it's dirt, right? Like it is this like kind of caked on stuff on the sky that simply falls apart when the sun arrives, right? So that, yeah, the darkness crumbles away. And we get this same kind of imagery here. You know, we got these torn fields, right? We've got the ash on the flower, the dropping poppies, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so the world that he describes here is very intensely physical and material, right? It's very much involved with it kind of, you know, all of it suggests things that you can touch, that you can feel, right?
I agree. He also said, talking to the rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies.
Uh-huh.
What is, like, cosmopolitan sympathies referring to in context?
So the rat will happily touch an English or a German hand and doesn't care, right? Doesn't care about those national identities, national borders. And I think that this is also kind of something that comes out of Rosenberg's relative outsider status, right? He's a British subject. He's born and raised in England. But because he's Jewish and the son of immigrants, his perspective is that of an outsider, right? Someone who is not typically included in the Georgian style, or the Georgian definition of British identity, right? He's a city boy, he's Jewish, his parents are immigrants, right? So, I think that like there's a nod there to the fact, you know, to his own maybe relative lack of enthusiasm for the cause. Because remember, like, you know, he's not somebody who enlists out of a sense of patriotic duty, right? He enlists out of a sense of economic necessity, right? You know, it's my mother and my sister will starve if I don't.
Yeah.
So, you know, he's not someone who is deeply invested in the cause. You know, plus, you know, by 1916, when he writes this poem, the number of people who are still deeply invested in the cause has shrunk quite a bit. So, one more poem I do kind of want to quickly talk about because it does give us a different, another kind of difference in perspective, right? I want to talk a little bit about the May Wedderburn Cannan poem. So this is Cannan at age 20 in the uniform of, where the hell was the damn eraser? It was called Volunteer Aid Detachment. Right, members of which were colloquially referred to as VADs. And so, what the VADs, so this was the primary role, like the primary direct role that women could play in the war, right? So, members of the VADs, you know, they were sometimes nurses. They ran canteens and hospitals away from the front. Several of them also worked in munitions factories. And they also produced propaganda. In fact, a lot of the pro-war propaganda was focused on men doing their duty by British women.
Yeah, I saw the one that was like, men, go, or something like that.
There's another one here that I want to, here we go. Here we've got a man's elderly mother, right? telling him it's his duty to go off and fight, right? Go, it's your duty, lad, right? Do it for mom.
Go. No, I'm not gonna say it.
And here we've also got, like, this is one of my favorites posters of the year. We've got an ape with a Kaiser Wilhelm mustache and a club.
What's this called? Does that say
Kultur, yeah, Kultur, German for culture, yeah. And a little spiky helmet. And note what he's carrying here.
A helpless lady.
Yeah, he's carrying a helpless woman in state of half undress, right? So this mad brute, right? This, this mad German brute, this ape, is threatening to British womanhood, right? Who must be protected from this insane beast. And there are others, like there's the one you were talking about, the women of Britain say go, right? We've got the man's wife and the men's wife and daughter, right? Watching them march off to war. I remember a Disney movie is what's actually talking. I think it takes place during World War II, not World War I. I don't know if you've ever seen Bedknobs and Broomsticks, starring Angela Lansbury.
I don't think so. I'm not sure.
But there's a similar sort of scene at the end where the male lead, goes marching off to join the army, waving to the family that he's leaving behind, right? And everybody's happy and singing and marching together. And I think like for somebody like May Wedderburn Cannan, this is the only part of the war that she directly sees, right? She's not present at the front. She only sees the men as they're going out or coming back. And so this poem, Rouen, which we're not going to dwell too much on because we're running short on time here, describes her experiences working as a volunteer in one of these canteens in France, right, where they're preparing soldiers to go off to the front. And, I will say that, in the past, I have been very hard on this poem. I don't think it's a particularly good poem. The lines are very long and sometimes a little clunky. And the vision of war it presents always seems to me a little bit blinkered. But I think that, one thing we have to keep in mind is, this is a poem written by a 21-year-old woman with limited world experience who has volunteered to go off and lend her support to soldiers going off to fight in the war. She's primarily interested in keeping their spirits up. And I feel like it's kind of relevant to debates that we have now about supporting the troops, right? Whereas on the right wing, people tend to argue that supporting the troops means supporting whatever war effort they're engaged in, right? That if you're talking down about the war, then you're not supporting the troops. Whereas on the left, people tend to argue that the best way to support the troops is not to send them to war in the first place, and then to make sure they're well taken care of when they come back. So we can probably identify Cannan more closely with that kind of right-wing idea, right? That to say negative things about the war is to denigrate those who fight in it. And I think we need to take this idea seriously because she does. And yeah, we're out of time, so we can't really dig into this rather long and slow and again slightly linguistically clunky poem. But the thing that I'm asking is to try to read it with a relatively sympathetic eye. And try to keep in mind what her experience is at the time that she's writing this. And again, this is written by a very young person.
Yeah.
Okay, so here are the guide questions for The Wasteland. They might help you understand it, they might not. But like I said, don't freak out if you don't get it.